The ARK. The world had become unrecognizable, not all at once. That never happens. It had been gradual, the way all great corruption unfolds. A small deviation here, a concession there, a generation that forgot what the one before it still vaguely remembered, and another generation that didn't even know there was something to remember. When Noah opened his eyes in the morning and looked around, what he saw was no longer the world the Eternal had declared good. It was something else. It was a place where violence had become so commonplace it no longer caused astonishment, where men did as they pleased with the weak and nobody called it by its right name, where words had been hollowed out until they meant nothing and sacred gestures had been traded for rituals of power and pleasure. The scripture says that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was continually only evil. Continually. This is a diagnosis of the dominant orientation of the human heart, a corruption so deep the scripture describes it as total. Not a declaration that every last trace of moral perception had been extinguished from human nature, but that the will had been so thoroughly turned against what was right that the prevailing direction, the overwhelming current of human thought and desire, ran against God. That is already devastating enough. You do not need to exaggerate what the text says for it to be terrible. It is terrible as it stands. And then God looked upon the earth. What does it mean to say that God looked and repented of having made man? Not that he made an error, nor that he was taken by surprise. Scripture uses here a language that adapts itself to our human understanding. Not because God suffers as we suffer, for he is immutable and impassible in his nature, but because the reality of his love and his repudiation of evil is expressed in the terms closest to our own experience. The grief that the text attributes to God is not passion in the creaturely sense. It is the language of a father watching a son destroy everything he was made for, rendered in human terms so that we can grasp it. And the word Scripture uses, "it grieved him at his heart," is the word chosen precisely because no lighter word would do. The world would be destroyed. The decision was made, not as a whim of power, but as the only coherent response to a creation that had refused to be what it was made to be. The flesh had corrupted its way upon the earth. The earth was filled with violence. Those were the terms: corrupted flesh, earth filled with violence. Two diagnoses that completed each other, one internal, one external. What was inside men overflowed outward and saturated the very ground they walked on. But there was one man, just one, in all that world: Noah. The scripture says Noah was just and blameless in his generation and that he walked with God. Three distinct things: just, blameless, and walking with God. This is not redundancy. Just refers to his conduct before others. He did not steal, did not oppress, did not lie. Blameless says something about the wholeness of his person. There was no division between what he showed and what he was. And walking with God is something else again. It is intimacy. It is the kind of relationship that Enoch, his ancestor, had also had. The same verb, the same quality of presence. Noah did not merely observe rules. He lived with the awareness that there was someone with whom he was walking and that changed everything. How old was Noah when God spoke to him? 500 years. He had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. He was a formed man. He had lived long enough to know deeply the world around him, to have no illusions about what men were capable of doing. And in spite of all that, or because of it, he remained blameless. Then God spoke to Noah, not to a priest in a temple, not to a king, not to the most powerful or most educated man, to this man who walked with him. And what he said was not easy to hear. He said the end of all flesh had come before his face because the earth was filled with violence through men. He said he was going to destroy men along with the earth. And then, and here the story of the ark begins, he said, "Make yourself an ark of gopher wood." An ark, a word that in Hebrew, teba, appears in only 2 places in the entire scripture. Here, and when Moses' mother places her son in a basket and sets him on the waters of the Nile. In both cases, the word describes a vessel that floats, not a ship designed to navigate with bow and stern and keel. A vessel that floats, a container upon the waters. This matters because it says something about what the ark was meant to be. Not an instrument of escape, not a survival machine, but a place of keeping. Something that contained, preserved, protected what was inside while what was outside passed through destruction. But before speaking of dimensions, it is worth pausing at the material. Gopher wood. This is one of the most mysterious words in all of Hebrew. Gopher appears nowhere else in Scripture. There is no way to know with certainty what it was. Ancient translators debated it. Some said cedar, others cypress, others ebony. The oldest and most widely supported tradition points to cypress, a dense, resinous wood that resists water and rot extraordinarily well. The Greeks used cypress for ships. The Phoenicians did too. It was known to last centuries if well worked. But the text does not say cypress. It says gopher. And perhaps that ambiguity is itself a datum. This specific wood, for this specific purpose, had no equivalent in any other human construction. It was unique to that task. God continued the instructions. "You shall make rooms in the ark, and you shall cover it inside and outside with pitch." Pitch was the waterproofing substance, a bituminous resin that sealed the gaps between planks and prevented water from entering. Applied inside and outside, every surface protected. This already tells you how long the voyage would last. Long enough that the wood needed to be completely waterproofed. This would not be a matter of days. And then the measurements. 300 cubits in length, 50 in width, 30 in height. The cubit was the basic measurement of the ancient world, based on the distance from the elbow to the tip of the middle finger. It varied slightly from people to people, but the most common estimate places it at around 45 centimeters. Doing the math, the ark would be 135 meters long, 22.5 meters wide, and 13.5 meters tall. These were the dimensions of a colossal structure. For reference, a football pitch is 105 meters long. The ark was longer than that, and if we consider that there were 3 decks, because the text speaks of lower, middle, and upper stories, each deck had about 4.5 meters of clearance. The total volume would be somewhere around 40,000 cubic meters. No one had built anything like it before. Never. And the ones who would build it were Noah and his sons. 1 window, 1 door in the side, 3 decks. The window, in Hebrew tzohar, which some translate as an opening for light, was to be set a cubit below the top. It was a continuous strip of opening running around the upper part of the ark, just beneath the roof covering. Not a window in the sense of an opening in a vertical wall, but an unbroken gap through which light would enter and air would circulate. Some who meditated on this described it as a precious stone placed there that shone inside the ark during the night. This is not in the text itself, but it belongs to the long meditation of those who tried to imagine how Noah and his family survived months of total darkness. The idea is not absurd. The word tzohar in other contexts is associated with the light of midday, with brightness. What exactly this opening was, the text does not specify precisely enough for a definitive answer. The door was in the side. 1 door, singular, through which all would enter, the 8 humans, the animals, the food, and which would be closed, as the text later reveals, not by Noah, but by God himself. Now Noah heard all of this. He heard the dimensions, the materials, the purpose, and then God told him something that needed to be understood before anything else began. He said he would establish his covenant with Noah, that he would enter the ark, he and his sons, his wife and his sons' wives with him. That of every living thing, of all flesh, 2 of every kind would come into the ark to be kept alive, male and female. Birds according to their kinds, animals according to their kinds, every creeping thing of the ground according to its kind, and that Noah was to take with him every sort of food that is eaten and store it up so that it would serve as food for them and for the animals. Noah did so. According to all that God commanded him, so he did. That phrase, according to all that God commanded him, so he did, appears more than once in the account. It is not careless repetition. It is the backbone of the entire story. In a world where every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was continually only evil, there was one man whose response to what God said was, "So he did." No negotiation, no adjustments, no, "but what if?" So he did. This means Noah began to build. And here begins the part that Scripture does not detail word by word, but which those who came after meditated upon carefully and which tradition has preserved consistently. Because Scripture says Noah was 500 years old when his sons were born, and 600 years old when the flood came. This does not mean the construction took 100 years. The texts do not state that with precision. But they do say the time was long. And during that time, Noah was not only building, he was speaking. The tradition of those who meditated on this text, including some of the deepest interpreters of Scripture from the early centuries, is clear on this point. Noah was a preacher of righteousness. The second letter of Peter uses precisely that title for him, a preacher of righteousness. Not a metaphor. It means that while he was cutting timber, while his sons measured and sawed and caulked, Noah was speaking to the world around him about what was coming, about the destruction, about the possibility of turning back. No one listened. Think about what that meant in practice. Every morning Noah and his sons rose and went to work on something that had never existed before, for a reason that had never happened before, at God's command, while around them life continued as though nothing would ever change. People passed by. They saw the construction. They asked what it was. Noah explained. And they laughed or ignored it or moved on to the next subject. Not because they were all necessarily cruel, though cruelty was abundant enough in that world, but because the scale of what Noah was saying exceeded anything they could imagine. A flood that would destroy all flesh, the whole earth covered with water, that had never happened. Their experience told them the world kept going. It always had. Why would it stop now? This is the kind of faith the building of the ark demanded. Not the faith of someone who sees signs and wonders and concludes God exists, but the faith of someone who heard the voice of God, understood what was being asked, and set to work with no visible confirmation that the work made any sense. The rain had not started. The water level had not risen. The animals had given no signal. The only foundation Noah had was the word God had spoken to him. The letter to the Hebrews would speak of this centuries later. By faith, having been warned by God about things not yet seen, Noah, in reverent fear, constructed an ark for the saving of his household. But that same text says more than faith alone. It says reverent fear, and it says he prepared, he built, he acted, he worked. The faith was real, and because it was real, it could not remain internal. It had to become action. For Noah, to believe was to build. Authentic faith expresses itself in works, and the works would not have existed without the faith. It was not faith without works, nor works without faith. It was the indissoluble unity of believing and acting that the ancient wisdom always recognized as the path of righteousness. Each plank he nailed was an act of trust. Each layer of pitch he applied was a declaration that what was not yet seen was more real than everything that was. Now Noah heard all of this. He heard the dimensions, the materials, the purpose, and he began. How long did it take? Scripture does not say explicitly, but it says Noah was 600 years old when the flood came, and that his sons were already adults with wives when they entered the ark. The construction extended across what were almost certainly decades. Ancient interpreters vary in their estimates, but a long period makes sense for a structure of this scale. And it was during this long period that every day was a renewal of the same decision, to continue doing what appeared absurd to everyone who watched. The sons of Noah grew up in this atmosphere. Shem, Ham, and Japheth were raised by a father who walked with God and who was building an impossible thing for an impossible reason. They were raised in the tension between what the world said was real and what their father said was true. And they stayed. They kept working. Their wives, too. 8 people in total. And that was the entirety of humanity that would be preserved. Scripture is economical about Noah's inner life. It does not tell us whether he slept soundly or woke in the middle of the night carrying the weight of what he knew. It does not tell us whether he had moments of doubt, whether on some evening he looked at the ark under construction and wondered if he had heard correctly. Scripture only says he did according to all that God commanded him. But that narrative economy does not erase the man's humanity. He was human. He had fears. He had the experience of years of preaching without result. He had the daily sight of a world marching toward the abyss and refusing to be saved. What sustained him was not courage in the sense of an absence of fear. It was something deeper, the awareness that there was a presence that had been walking with him through those 500 years. The relationship he had with God was not new when he received the command. It was the result of a long intimacy. God had not appeared from nowhere to ask an impossible thing of a stranger. He had spoken to someone who already knew him, who had already learned to distinguish his voice, who already had a history of mutual faithfulness, and that intimacy expressed itself in how the command was given. God did not merely say, "Build." He explained. He said why the flood would come. He said who would be preserved. He said how it would happen. He established a covenant even before the flood began, which was extraordinary. The covenant came before the crossing, not after. This is a sign of real relationship. Someone who trusts you explains. Someone who merely commands does not need to give reasons. God explained to Noah what was about to happen because Noah was someone with whom he walked. Now, the practical dimensions of the daily work of construction. Gopher wood, whether cypress or another dense resinous species, is a hard wood. Difficult to work without proper tools. The axes of the pre-flood era were not made of brittle metal. Tradition speaks of men who worked with metals since the descendants of Cain. There were quality tools, but even with good tools, cutting enough wood for a structure of this size was a work of years, not months, years. The logical sequence of construction would have begun with the keel, the base beam running the entire length of the ark, upon which everything else would rest. It was the spine of the structure. It had to come first, and it needed to be either a single piece or sections joined with the precision required to bear the weight of everything above. A cypress log 135 meters long does not exist, so the keel was made of sections joined by joinery that the carpentry tradition developed to ensure the joint is as strong as the surrounding material. Then would come the ribs, the curved beams rising from the keel on both sides to form the characteristic shape of the hull. Each rib was bent with heat and steam, or shaped from naturally curved trunks. Cypress has the characteristic of growing with natural curvature in some species, which would be useful for this purpose. The ribs determined the ark's form, not a rectangular box, but a shape that, even without a pointed prow, had enough curvature so that water would run off the sides rather than collect on top. The planks of the hull covered the ribs, overlapping like scales to minimize exposed joints, and caulked with pitch before the next layer was applied. Each plank fitted to the one before it with a precision that comes only from experience and patience. A millimeter gap inadequately caulked would be enough to admit a thread of water, and a thread of water under pressure over months would become a current. The pitch was prepared in heated cauldrons. Bituminous resin, when heated, becomes liquid and penetrating. Applied with brushes made of plant fiber or animal hair, it covered every surface. The smell was strong. The work was hot and sticky and demanded constant care not to leave bubbles, and it needed to dry before the next coat was applied. Waterproofing the entire ark, inside and out, across a structure of that size, was itself a work of months. The decks were structured by horizontal beams crossing the width of the ark to support the floor above. Those beams had to be dimensioned to bear the weight of large animals: bulls, elephants, hippopotamuses, rhinoceroses, bears. A single adult elephant can weigh more than 5 tons. If there was a pair of elephants on the lower deck, the structure supporting them needed to be robust enough not to fail during months of movement through the waters, which would rock the ark in every direction. The internal compartments divided each deck into cells. God's command specified chinim, nests, cells, chambers. The plural indicates multiplicity. This was not merely a rough division into 2 or 3 spaces. It was a series of chambers, each dimensioned for what it would contain. Chambers for large animals, chambers for smaller ones, chambers for birds, chambers for reptiles, chambers for food stores, chambers for the human family, each with its specific function, and the layout of all of them calculated so that the weight would be distributed in a way that maintained the ark's stability. The weight was a central problem. A wooden structure of this size, filled with animals and food and water, would weigh tens of thousands of tons. The load capacity depended on the volume of water displaced, and the ark's dimensions produced a displaced volume sufficient to bear that load with a safety margin. This was not coincidence. The measurements given by God were not arbitrary. They were the right measurements for what the ark needed to do. The roof was another critical element. The covering of the ark had to be inclined enough for rainwater to run off without accumulating, because water pooling on top would add weight in the wrong place and compromise stability. The slope of the roof and the tsohar opening just below it created a passive drainage system that functioned without any human intervention. While the construction advanced, the people around it continued their lives. They ate, they drank, they married, they gave in marriage. These are the very words Jesus would use centuries later, speaking about this period. People were living their lives as though tomorrow was always guaranteed, not necessarily out of specific malice, though malice was plentiful enough in that world, but out of that deep inertia that prevents the human heart from taking seriously what it cannot see. Noah could see, or rather, he could hear, and what he heard changed everything. Now, the animals. Before they came, there had to be a place to put them, and a place to put them also meant a place to store their food. God had specified, "Take with you every sort of food that is eaten." Each animal species eats something different. Carnivores and herbivores, dried fish, grain, dehydrated fruit, fodder, and hay. The storage space had to be substantial and was probably distributed across the decks in a way that facilitated management. If you need to feed an elephant every day for months, you do not want its food on the upper deck while the elephant is below. Water also needed to be stored. Although the flood would bring water in absurd quantities, water mixed with the decomposing earth and flesh of a destroyed world would not necessarily be drinkable. The Ark would need to carry reserves of fresh water sufficient for the first days or weeks until the situation could be assessed. And then there was waste. 8 humans plus a large number of animals of different species produce organic waste in considerable volumes. Without adequate ventilation, the Ark would become uninhabitable within days. The opening at the top, the tsohar, the strip of light below the covering, was not only for light, it was for air. The circulation of air inside a closed space containing hundreds of different animal species at temperatures that would vary over months of flood was a matter of survival. The Ark's design accounted for this because God accounted for this. The opening was specified. It was there for a reason. While all of this was being built, the world went on. And in the tradition that meditates on this period, a period that lasted decades, the image that emerges is of Noah speaking. Speaking to those who passed, speaking to those who approached with curiosity, explaining what was being built and why. Preacher of righteousness. Not because he enjoyed preaching, not because he was naturally eloquent, but because what he knew was too heavy to carry in silence. He had heard the voice of God say that the end was coming. How do you stay quiet about that? And the world did not stop. People lived their lives as though the tomorrow was always secured. They did not stop to listen. Not because all of them were monsters, though the violence of that world was real and documented in the text, but because what Noah was saying demanded a rupture with everything comfortable. To take him seriously would have meant stopping, turning, acknowledging that the life they were living was pointing toward a cliff. It was easier to call it madness. Noah's sons carried this too. They were young men living in the world but not of it, in the sense that they shared their father's perspective rather than that of their surroundings. They inherited both the faith and the burden. And when the time came to enter the Ark, they entered. No rebellion is recorded, no hesitation. They came from the same place as their father, from an obedience formed by intimacy, from a fidelity that had been exercised day by day across years of construction. The women, Noah's wife and his 3 daughters-in-law, are names the text does not record. They are present, but unnamed. They carried their share of the weight of what was being done. They cooked and worked and slept and woke across years under the shadow of that ark being built, with the knowledge that a day would come when they would enter it and the world they knew would be left outside. That is not a small thing to bear. And then the day came when God said to Noah, "Go into the ark, you and all your household." The construction was complete. Now, the animals came. This is one of the most astonishing moments in the account, and it is described with a brevity that almost conceals the miracle. They came to Noah in the ark, 2 by 2, of all flesh in which was the breath of life. Those who came were male and female of all flesh, and they came as God had commanded. The verb is, in a sense, passive. They came. They were not captured. They came. As if each species knew that it was time, knew where to go, knew that that enormous structure was the destination. Predators and prey together, lions and antelopes, snakes and rats, eagles and doves, each pair arriving, being directed to its compartment, settling there with a tranquility that was not natural, that was, in every sense of the word, supernatural. Those who have thought deeply about this passage have meditated on it as if something of the original harmony of creation, that harmony which existed before the fall, was being momentarily restored by the direct action of God, predator and prey at peace, not because their nature had changed, but because the one who made their nature was at work. This is how many of the ancient interpreters meditated on this mystery. The text does not explain the mechanism. What the text asserts is that they came, and they came as God commanded. By 7 days the animals entered. Day by day the flow continued, species by species, pair by pair, until all who were meant to be inside were inside. And then God closed the door. Not Noah, God. This is one of the quietest and heaviest statements in all the account. The Lord closed the door behind him. Noah did not close his own door. The last action before the flood began was not performed by a human being. It was performed by God. This says something about what was happening. The separation between those who were inside and those who were outside was not Noah's choice. It was a divine act. The ark was closed. The world remained outside. But it had not always been outside. The door had been open. For decades, as the construction rose plank by plank in the sight of all, the invitation had been standing. Noah had preached. He had warned. He had explained. The people had heard and had chosen. When God finally closed the door, he closed it not on people who had never been given a chance, but on people who had been given years of invitation and had declined each time. The mercy had been offered. The judgment came after the mercy, not instead of it. And 7 days later, the waters of the flood were upon the earth. On the 17th day of the 2nd month, in Noah's 600th year, all the springs of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. Rain fell upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. Here the account could continue through the flood itself, through the waters that rose, through the 150 days the ark floated, through the mountain of Ararat where it rested, through the birds sent out, through the rainbow and the new covenant. But that is another story. The story of this telling is the ark, what it was, how it was built, what it cost to build it. And what it cost was everything a man has. It cost decades of physically exhausting work on a scale that surpassed anything that had ever been done. It cost the weight of knowing what was coming and not being able to convince anyone. It cost the strangeness of being the only one in an entire world doing that specific thing for that specific reason. It cost the faith that does not require evidence because it has something more solid than evidence. It has the word of the one who does not fail. And Noah built, so he did. Each plank he cut was an act of obedience. Each bucket of pitch he applied was an act of trust. Each compartment he built was a preparation for a life he could not yet see. Each day he woke and returned to work while the world around him lived as though nothing would change was a deliberate choice to move toward what is true rather than toward what is comfortable. In the centuries that followed, those who thought deeply about this text saw in the ark layers of meaning that the text itself invites. The wooden vessel bearing humanity through the waters of destruction. The one place of safety in a world that was perishing. The door closed by God, not by men, definitively separating those who were inside from those who were outside. Ancient voices, reflecting on the waters of the flood, saw in them a prefiguration of the waters of baptism, those waters that destroy the old and save those who pass through them. Peter himself draws this connection explicitly. The waters of the flood, he says, correspond to the water of baptism that now saves us. And those same voices saw in the ark itself an image of the community of the saved, the one place where life was preserved when the world outside was perishing. Just as there was no safety outside the ark when the waters came, so the ark became a figure of the community God gathers around himself for the deliverance of those who belong to him. These readings are not inventions layered on top of the text. They grow out of it. Noah built a vessel. The vessel floated. Those inside were saved. Those outside were not. The line between the two was drawn not by merit of strength or intelligence or social standing, but by where one was when the door closed. and the door had been preceded by years of open invitation. The ark Noah built was not perfect in the sense of being beautiful. It was not aesthetically elaborate. It was functional, robust, exactly what it needed to be. 300 cubits long, 50 wide, 30 high, 3 decks, 1 door, a strip of light below the covering, coated with pitch inside and outside, full of compartments, ready to receive everything that was to be saved. And when the flood came, it floated. Not because Noah was the greatest carpenter in the world, not because the materials were the finest available, but because the one who gave the instructions knew what he was asking for, and what he was asking for was sufficient. The ark was the visible physical form of a word that God had given, and a word from God does not return empty. The proportions of the ark, 300 by 50 by 30 cubits, produce a length-to-width ratio of 6:1. This is not arbitrary. That ratio is recognized as structurally suited to a vessel that needs to maintain stability in rough conditions without propulsion. The ark did not need to go anywhere. It needed simply not to capsize, and those proportions made it extraordinarily stable. The one who gave the dimensions had not consulted any human engineer. He was the one who designed the seas the ark would float upon. When Noah finally received the command to go in, when the last animal had entered and the last provision had been stored and the family of 8 had taken their places, God closed the door behind them. The world they had known, the world in which Noah had spent 6 centuries, in which he had been born and had grown old and had built and had preached, stayed on the other side of that door. And on the 7th day after, the deep broke open. It is worth staying with that for a moment. The 7 days between the closing of the door and the beginning of the flood. Noah inside the closed ark with his family and all the animals waiting. The world outside still dry, still going about its days. 7 days in which the decision was already made and the judgment had not yet fallen. 7 days of a silence that must have been unlike any silence before or since. And then the windows of the heavens opened. What follows is not the story of this telling, but everything that follows. The survival of 8 people and the pairs of every creature, the preservation of life through the greatest catastrophe the earth had ever known, the covenant sealed with a rainbow, the new beginning from a purified world, all of it rested on what had been done before the first drop fell. It rested on the decades of work, on the tons of gopher wood cut and shaped and joined and sealed, on the compartments built with care for animals that had not yet arrived, on the stores of food accumulated for a voyage whose length was unknown, on the fidelity of a man who woke each morning and went back to work on an impossible thing because the one he walked with had told him it was necessary. The ark stood not as an achievement of human ingenuity. It stood as the material expression of a relationship between a man and his God, a relationship built over centuries and tested by the most improbable commission in history. Noah did not build the ark because he understood everything. He built it because he trusted the one who did. So he did. That is the whole story, not only of a construction, of an obedience, of a man who, in a world entirely given over to corruption, kept the straight path, not because it was easy, it could not have been easy, but because there was a presence with him that made possible what would otherwise have been impossible. The ark was built by human hands from natural materials with the tools of his time, but it was conceived before it existed by the one who knows the end from the beginning. And what meets in that junction, the human and the divine, the obedience and the grace, the work and the word, is where the story of Noah will always live. The waters came, the ark floated, and 8 people survived for the world to begin again.